The escape pod hit atmosphere like a brick thrown at a window, and Jonah's wreath had just enough time to think, "This is going to hurt," before the retro thrusters failed and gravity remembered it had a job to do. The impact carved a smoking trench through purple grassland that shouldn't exist on a moon this small, and Jonas lay in the wreckage wondering if broken ribs were supposed to make breathing feel like swallowing glass. His heads-up display flickered with damage reports that basically summarized to "everything is broken, and you're lucky to be alive." The meridian drift was gone, atomized in high orbit when the reactor containment finally gave up after 3 months of neglect, and Jonas's increasingly creative attempts at preventive maintenance with spare parts and prayer. He'd made it to the escape pod with maybe 5 seconds to spare, which was either excellent timing or proof that the universe had a mean sense of humor. The distress beacon was broadcasting, which would be great if this sector had any traffic. According to his last navigation update before things went catastrophically wrong, this was the outer frontier, abandoned during the expansion wars when both sides realized they were fighting over real estate nobody wanted. The odds of rescue were somewhere between unlikely and start practicing eating rocks. Jonas dragged himself out of the pod's wreckage, took stock of his injuries. Ribs definitely broken, left arm not working right, head bleeding from somewhere he couldn't see, and made the executive decision to find shelter before shock caught up with his adrenaline. The scanner still functioned barely and showed structural signatures about 3 kilometers northwest. Civilization, maybe, or at least buildings that might have walls and roofs. The walk took 2 hours and felt like 2 years. The purple grass was soft enough to cushion his frequent stops to rest and contemplate poor life choices. The moon's sun was smaller than Earth's, redder, and the light it cast made everything look vaguely threatening in a way Jonas's concussed brain couldn't quite articulate. He kept expecting local fauna to appear and finish what the crash started, but apparently this moon was as empty as the sector. The buildings appeared gradually, growing from the landscape like they'd been here long enough to become part of it. Prefab colonial construction, Jonas recognized. The kind of modular units that mining operations threw up when they found deposits worth exploiting but not worth permanent infrastructure. These looked maintained but tired, paint faded, seals weathered, the whole settlement giving off the vibe of making do with whatever hadn't broken yet. Jonas stumbled into what looked like a town square and had enough functioning brain cells left to think, "There are a lot of people staring at me," before his legs decided they were done with the whole walking thing. He went down hard, caught himself on his good arm, and looked up at a circle of faces that were definitely not human. Keshari, his memory supplied helpfully. Species index briefing from academy training he'd mostly slept through. Humanoid, bilateral symmetry, those distinctive long ears that tapered to elegant points. Comparable to humans in most respects, except for the iridescent skin patterns that shifted based on emotion, and the fact that they'd achieved interstellar flight while humans were still arguing about whether the Earth was flat. Every single face looking at him belonged to a woman, every single one. "Hi," Jonas managed, because his brain defaulted to politeness when confronted with situations it couldn't process. "Sorry to drop in unannounced. My ship had a disagreement with Physics and Physics 1. I don't suppose you have medical facilities, and somewhere I could sleep for maybe a week." The silence stretched long enough that Jonas started wondering if his translator was broken. Then an older Keshari stepped forward, her silver hair elaborately braided and her ears adorned with jewelry that probably meant something important. Her skin patterns shifted through colors Jonas's concussed brain couldn't quite track. "I am Elder Murrin," she said, and her voice carried authority that made Jonas want to sit up straighter despite the broken ribs. "You are in Vale's Crossing. We will provide medical aid and shelter." She paused and something complicated crossed her features. "But I must ask, are you male?" Jonas blinked, trying to figure out if that was a translation error or just a really weird question. Yes. Human male specifically." Jonah's wreath, formerly of the cargo hauler Meridian Drift, currently of nowhere because my ship is a debris field. The reaction was immediate and unsettling. A ripple of sound moved through the gathered crowd, voices rising in what might have been excitement or alarm or possibly both. Women pressed closer, and Jonas noticed their ears tilting toward him in unison, like organic sensor arrays locking onto a target. Several looked like they wanted to touch him, hands rising and then falling back as if remembering social conventions at the last second. "How long has it been?" Someone in the crowd asked, voice tight with something Jonas couldn't identify. 43 years, Murren said quietly, still watching Jonas with that complicated expression. 43 years since any male of any species set foot in Vale's Crossing. Jonas's brain, already struggling with the concussion and broken ribs and general trauma of the day, tried to process that number and failed spectacularly. "I'm sorry, 43 what now?" "Years." Murren gestured, and two younger Keshari stepped forward to help Jonas stand. Their hands were careful but their grip was firm, and Jonas noticed they were both staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl in ways that had nothing to do with injury. "Come, we will treat your wounds and provide accommodations. Then we will discuss your situation." "My situation is pretty straightforward," Jonas said as they half-carried him toward a building marked with medical symbols. "I need to build a beacon strong enough to reach active shipping lanes, which will take maybe a month with proper materials. Then I get picked up and I'm out of your hair, or ears, whatever the polite expression is." "A month," someone murmured behind him, and the tone was absolutely not appropriate for discussing logistics. Jonas decided his concussion was making him imagine things and focused on not passing out as they maneuvered him into the clinic. The facility was clean but sparse, equipment that looked functional but outdated by maybe 20 years. A medical scanner hummed to life as they lowered him onto an examination table, and Jonas closed his eyes against the bright overhead lights. 3 fractured ribs, minor concussion, lacerations requiring sealing. A new voice announced, clinically professional. "Nothing life-threatening. He'll need rest and monitoring for the next 72 hours. "I'll take first watch," someone said immediately. "No, I will," another voice countered. "I have medical training." "We all have medical training, Sira. Don't pretend this is about qualifications." Jonas opened his eyes to find 3 Keshari women having what looked like the beginning of an argument. Their ears tilted back in aggressive postures, and their skin patterns flashing through colors that definitely indicated strong emotions. Murren silenced them with a gesture. "We will establish a rotation," the elder said firmly. "Jonah's wreath is our guest and will be treated with appropriate respect and care. Is that understood?" The 3 women subsided, but Jonas caught the looks they exchanged. The way their eyes kept flicking back to him like he was a problem none of them wanted to share. He had a sudden, deeply uncomfortable realization that his simple plan, rest, repair, leave, might be significantly more complicated than anticipated. "Elder Murren," he said carefully, "why exactly haven't you seen a man in 43 years? Murren's expression softened into something that might have been sympathy. Vale's Crossing was established as a mining cooperative, all-female crew. When the company abandoned operations, supply ships stopped coming. No traders, no travelers. We've survived through self-sufficiency and cooperation, but we've been isolated from the wider galaxy for decades." She paused. "You are the first male of any species to enter our community in all that time. Do you understand what that means?" Jonas understood, in the way that people understand disasters right before they happen. "I'm going to be a problem." "You already are," Murren said, not unkindly. "But we will manage. Rest now. We'll discuss the complications when you're recovered." Jonas closed his eyes and listened to the soft sounds of the clinic, the murmur of voices outside, the hum of medical equipment. Somewhere in the background, he could hear 2 women arguing about whose turn it was to monitor the guest, and he realized with dawning horror that his worst day, crash, injuries, stranded, might just be the beginning of a much more complicated problem. All he wanted was a place to sleep. Apparently, the universe had other plans. Jonas woke to the sound of aggressive whispering and the uncomfortable realization that 3 Keshari women were having a territorial dispute over who got to check his vital signs. His ribs hurt less than yesterday, which he was choosing to interpret as healing rather than nerve damage, and his head had downgraded from "someone's driving spikes through my skull" to mild jackhammer. "I'm awake," he announced, because pretending to sleep through the argument felt cowardly. "And I can check my own vitals if it helps resolve whatever's happening here." All 3 women turned to look at him with simultaneous intensity that made Jonas regret speaking. Their ears perked forward in that way he was learning meant focused attention, and their skin patterns shifted through colors he still couldn't interpret but suspected weren't good. "You shouldn't move yet," said the one on the left, whose name tag identified her as Kira. "You need at least another day of monitoring." "I've had worse," Jonas lied, attempting to sit up and immediately regretting it as his ribs reminded him they were still broken. "Ow, okay, maybe I need more monitoring." "I told you," Kira said to her companions with obvious satisfaction. "He requires continued care." "We all agreed on the rotation schedule," countered the middle woman, whose tag read Vesna. "You had the night shift, it's my turn." "The schedule didn't account for him waking early," the third woman, Jana, pointed out, "which means the situation is flexible." Jonas watched this exchange with growing alarm. "Look, I appreciate the medical attention, but I really don't need 3 people hovering. Maybe just leave the scanner running and check in periodically." "Unacceptable," all 3 said in unison, then glared at each other for agreeing. The clinic door opened, and Elder Murrin entered with the energy of someone who'd already handled 6 crises before breakfast. She took in the scene, sighed deeply, and made a gesture that had all 3 attendants reluctantly filing out of the room. "I apologize," Murrin said once they were alone. 43 years is apparently long enough to forget how to behave rationally around novelty." "Novelty," Jonas repeated. "That's one word for it. Elder Murrin, I think we need to talk about the elephant in the room. Or the human. The unexpected male human who's apparently causing some kind of social incident." Murrin settled into a chair beside his bed, and her expression was tired in a way that suggested she'd been dealing with exactly this problem since Jonas arrived. "Vale's Crossing has survived through cooperation and mutual respect. We've built a functional community from isolation, but your presence is disrupting balances that took decades to establish. I'm literally just lying here being injured." "Yes, and that's the problem. You represent something that hasn't existed in our community for 2 generations. The younger women have never encountered a male of any species. The older ones remember, but memory is different from presence." She rubbed her temples in a gesture Jonas recognized as universal for "I have a migraine." "Already, I've had 7 requests for priority access to assist you, 3 proposals to reassign living quarters to be closer to the clinic, and 1 suggestion that we establish a lottery system for your time once you're mobile." Jonas felt his face heating with embarrassment. "A lottery? You're joking." "I wish I were." Murrin leaned forward. "Jonas Reith, I need you to understand something. Vale's Crossing functions because we've learned to share resources, space, and opportunity with equity and patience. But you are not a resource to be managed, and yet that's how some are beginning to think. This is dangerous." "What do you want me to do?" "I need time to heal and build a beacon. I can't exactly leave early." "I know, but perhaps you can help me prevent this situation from escalating. Be visible, be ordinary, don't show preference or allow yourself to become a prize to win." She smiled slightly. "And perhaps use that human humor I've heard about. Make yourself less mythical and more real." Jonas spent the next 3 days taking Murrin's advice and immediately regretting it. The moment he was mobile enough to leave the clinic, He discovered that Vale's crossing had transformed around his presence like an ecosystem, responding to an invasive species. The settlement's central square, previously a quiet space where residents went about their business with efficient cooperation, now felt like a market where he was the main attraction. Women found reasons to be wherever Jonas happened to be. Conversation stopped when he approached, and he caught more sideways glances in an hour than he'd accumulated in his entire previous life. Murrin had arranged a workshop space for beacon construction, a converted storage unit stocked with salvaged electronics and enough tools to attempt the impossible. Jonas threw himself into the work with relief, grateful for something concrete to focus on besides the increasingly weird social dynamics outside. He lasted 40 minutes before the first visitor arrived with food. "You missed breakfast," Sierra explained, setting down a tray of something that smelled amazing. "Can't work on an empty stomach." "Thanks," Jonas said, genuinely appreciative. "That's kind of you." Sierra's ears tilted forward and her skin patterns shifted through warm colors. "It's nothing. I could bring lunch too if you'd like. And dinner. Actually, I could just handle all your meals if that would be helpful." Jonas searched for polite refusal and found none. "That's really generous, but I don't want to impose." "It's not an imposition." Sierra moved closer, and Jonas became acutely aware of personal space and how she wasn't respecting it. "I'm an excellent cook, much better than some others who might offer." The door opened again and Liz entered carrying her own tray. She stopped, took in the scene, and her ears flattened back against her head. "Sierra, I didn't realize you'd be here." "I brought breakfast," Sierra said defensively. "Someone has to ensure our guest is properly fed." "How thoughtful. I brought lunch, actually, and I was planning to discuss engineering solutions with Jonas." Liz smiled at him, and it was not a friendly smile despite being directed his way. "I have extensive experience with communication systems." "How convenient that you suddenly remembered this expertise," Sierra said sweetly. Jonas looked between them and made an executive decision. "You know what? Why don't you both stay? We can eat together and you can both help with the beacon. Cooperation makes everything faster, right?" The suggestion did not have the calming effect he'd hoped for. Both women looked at him like he'd proposed something scandalous, then at each other with expressions that could have flash-frozen water. But they stayed and they helped, and Jonas spent the next 3 hours refereeing what could only be described as competitive engineering while trying to actually make progress on the beacon. It got worse. By the end of the first week, Jonas had a rotation schedule he didn't request, gifts appearing at his quarters he didn't ask for, and invitations to dinners, cultural events, and something called a viewing party that he was too afraid to inquire about. The workshop became a revolving door of helpful assistants who spent more time watching him than actually assisting. The community dinners that had been shared, communal affairs, started segregating into factions. Jonas would see clusters of women who used to sit together, now deliberately separated, sorted by some criteria he didn't understand but suspected had everything to do with him. He tried humor, cracking jokes about human incompetence, and making himself the punchline of stories about every stupid thing humanity had done on its way to the stars. "We discovered faster-than-light travel by accident," he told an audience in the dining hall. "An engineer was trying to invent a better toaster and somehow opened a wormhole instead. That's humanity in a nutshell. We stumble into greatness while aiming for breakfast." They laughed, but their eyes never left him, and Jonas realized with sinking certainty that making himself more accessible had only made him more fascinating. 2 weeks in, Jonas was sitting in his quarters reviewing beacon schematics when he heard shouting outside. He opened the door to find Sierra and Liz having what looked like the preliminary stages of an actual physical confrontation, their ears flat back, and their voices raised in anger about visiting schedules and appropriate boundaries, and whose turn it was to deliver evening meal. "Stop," Jonas said, and his voice came out harder than intended. Both women froze, and he felt a dozen other residents watching from doorways and windows. Just stop. This is insane. You're fighting over delivering dinner to someone who can walk to the dining hall himself. Do you hear how absurd this is? You don't understand, Sira said, and her voice shook. This matters. Why? Explain it to me. Because from where I'm standing, I'm watching a community tear itself apart over one exhausted human who crashed here by accident and just wants to build a beacon and leave. Neither woman had an answer, and Jonas realized he was looking at the symptom of a deeper problem. Murrin had warned him about disrupting balances. He'd thought she meant social awkwardness. He was starting to understand she meant something more fundamental, something dangerous. I need to talk to Murrin, he said quietly, and then we need to fix this before someone gets hurt. Jonas found Elder Murrin in her office reviewing supply manifests and looking like someone who'd been averaging 3 hours of sleep for several weeks. She glanced up when he entered, took in his expression, and sighed in a way that suggested she'd been expecting this conversation. It's getting worse, Jonas said without preamble. Sira and Liz nearly came to blows over who gets to deliver my dinner. This is unsustainable. I know, Murrin set aside her datapad. I've received 17 formal complaints in the last 4 days. Old friendships are fracturing. Women who have worked together for years can barely speak. All because of you. I didn't ask for any of this. No, but you're here and intention doesn't matter when the result is chaos. She stood, moved to the window overlooking the settlement. I've been thinking about this problem constantly. The issue isn't you, Jonas. It's what you represent. Scarcity, novelty, the possibility of something we thought we'd lost forever. I'm not a resource, Jonas said firmly. I'm a person who's leaving in a few weeks. Logically, everyone knows this. Emotionally, rationality has left the building. Murrin turned to face him. So we need a different approach. You've been trying to be accommodating, to not show preference, to treat everyone equally. It's not working because it maintains you as the center of attention. We need to decenter you. How? By making you boring, ordinary, by shifting focus from what you represent to what can be accomplished together. Murrin pulled up a holographic display showing various infrastructure reports. Vale's Crossing has needed repairs and upgrades for years. We've managed through careful maintenance, but there are projects we've deferred because they required resources or expertise we lacked. You're an engineer, help us fix things. Jonas studied the list and felt something shift in his thinking. You want me to start public works projects. I want you to organize them. Force cooperation by making the work too big for any individual or small group. Create teams that mix factions, that require people to work together toward shared goals instead of competing for your attention. That might just make it worse. They'll compete to be on my team. Then don't lead teams. Organize them and rotate through, providing expertise where needed but never staying long enough to become the prize. Murrin's eyes were sharp. You said you don't want to be a resource. Prove it. Be a catalyst for the community to remember what it was before you arrived. Functional, cooperative, united. The water reclamation system had been running at 60% capacity for 3 years, compensated for by careful rationing and recycling protocols that everyone accepted as normal. Jonas spent 2 days analyzing the system, identifying bottlenecks, and designing repairs using available materials. Then he posted the project plan in the central square with a sign-up sheet for work crews. Mixed teams, he announced when people gathered to read the notice. I need people with different skills working together. Sira, your team 1 with Liz, Kira, and Vesna. Team 2 is Jana, Myril, and Thessa. We rotate every 4 hours. Nobody works alone, and I float between teams providing technical support. The silence was deafening. You're putting me with Liz, Sira said carefully. Yes, because you're both excellent engineers and this project needs your combined expertise. Unless you're saying you can't work together, Jonas let the challenge hang. Because if cooperation is impossible, then maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's that 43 years of isolation made everyone forget how to function as a community. Liss's ears tilted forward. We can work together. Excellent, we start tomorrow at first light. Bring tools and patience. Jonah's turned to leave, then stopped. And no bringing me food or drinks or anything else. We all eat together during breaks. Same meals, same time, no special treatment. Anyone who can't agree to these terms is off the project. The work was hard, physical, and required constant communication between teams. Jonas deliberately created situations where Sierra and Liss had to coordinate, where their success depended on cooperation rather than competition. He offered guidance but made them solve problems together, forcing them to remember skills they'd both developed over years of keeping veils crossing functional. On the third day, he heard them laughing, actually laughing together, about a joint solution to a valve pressure issue. Jonas pretended not to notice and moved to the next team. The project took 2 weeks, and by the end, water output had increased to 95% capacity. More importantly, Jonas noticed changes in the broader community. Women who'd stopped speaking were coordinating again. The dining hall felt less segmented. Sierra and Liss weren't exactly friends, but they weren't enemies either. The filtration grid next, Jonas announced at the celebration dinner marking the water system's completion. Then atmospheric processors. Then the power distribution network that's been making that concerning humming sound nobody wants to talk about. You're creating work, Kira observed. I'm organizing solutions to problems you've been deferring. There's a difference. Jonas accepted a plate of food that was exactly the same as everyone else's, a detail he'd insisted on. And I'm doing it in a way that reminds everyone that cooperation works better than competition. The community dinners became actual community events again, everyone contributing, everyone sharing. Jonas started calling them planning sessions, where they'd discuss upcoming projects, assign teams, solve problems collaboratively. He made himself aggressively ordinary, visible but not special, helpful but not central. He told stories about human failures while teaching repair techniques. There was this colony ship called the Perseverance, right? Name was apparently tempting fate. They tried to establish settlement on a garden world without properly surveying local fauna. Turns out the cute fuzzy things they thought were harmless were actually apex predators with a taste for electronics. Lost everything, had to be rescued by the very mining operation they'd been bragging about not needing. Moral of the story: hubris is humanity's least attractive feature, and we've got a lot of competition for that title. They laughed, but they also learned the lesson embedded in the humor. Check your assumptions, test before committing, pride precedes disaster. When direct questions came, about preference, about attraction, about the elephant in the room nobody wanted to acknowledge, Jonas answered with honest kindness but firm boundaries. Do you find any of us attractive? Vesna asked one evening, emboldened by the group setting and the general loosening of social tension. Objectively, yes, you're all attractive people. Jonas kept his tone matter-of-fact. But I'm here temporarily, I'm leaving soon, and I'm not interested in relationships that have expiration dates and weird power dynamics. More importantly, I'm not a prize to win or a resource to fight over. I'm just a guy trying to fix his situation, while hopefully not making yours worse. But if you weren't leaving, she pressed. I am leaving, so the question doesn't matter. He softened his tone. Look, I get that I represent something that's been absent for a long time, but focusing on me is focusing on scarcity. What happens when I'm gone? You going to fall apart again? Or are you going to remember that you survived 43 years through cooperation and community? Because from where I'm standing, that survival is a lot more impressive than anything I've done. The beacon construction became a rotating community project. Different people helping each shift. Jonas teaching basic principles so they'd have the knowledge after he left. He deliberately demystified the process, explaining that it wasn't genius but patience and careful application of fundamentals. Engineering is just applied common sense and stubbornness, he told a work crew while soldering communication arrays. 90% of the job is trying things that don't work and being too stubborn to quit. Humans aren't good at engineering because we're smart. We're good at it because we're too dumb to accept failure. 3 months after the crash, the beacon was finished, powerful enough to reach the shipping lanes that pass through the adjacent sector. Jonas activated it during a community gathering, everyone watching as the signal climbed through the atmosphere and disappeared into the dark. Response time depends on who's listening, Jonas explained. Could be days, could be weeks, but someone will hear it and then I'm out of your hair. Ears, someone corrected, and the joke that had been tired weeks ago now felt comfortable, familiar. The response came in 6 days. A transport hauler, wandering star, willing to detour for salvage rights to the Meridian Drift's remains. 1 week until pickup. Jonas spent that week saying goodbyes he hadn't expected to need. Sierra and Liz both thanked him, separately, for forcing them to remember they'd once been friends before competition had poisoned everything. Kira apologized for the territorial behavior in the clinic, laughing at herself in a way that suggested genuine embarrassment. Murren clasped his hand and told him that Vale's crossing owed him a debt they couldn't repay. "You didn't just teach us to fix water systems," she said quietly. "You taught us to fix ourselves." "You didn't need me for that," Jonas replied. "You needed a reminder. I just happened to crash in the right place." On the final morning, the entire settlement gathered at the landing zone. The wandering star descended through cloud cover, a battered hauler that looked only marginally more reliable than Jonas's destroyed ship. The captain, a grizzled Terran named Hayes, took one look at Vale's crossing and grinned. "Hell of a place to crash, Reith, all women." "Don't," Jonas said flatly, "just don't." He turned back to the assembled community, saw faces that had become familiar, people who'd gone from strangers to something resembling friends. "Thank you for the hospitality, the repairs, and the reminder that humanity doesn't have a monopoly on being stubborn and resilient. You've got everything you need to reconnect with the galaxy. Use the relay, call for supplies, open trade routes. Don't let isolation win." "Will you come back?" someone called. Jonas smiled. "Probably not. I'm a terrible pilot and worse at navigation. But I'll think of you whenever I complain about water pressure or community dinners. You've set an impossibly high standard." The transport lifted with Jonas aboard, and he watched through the viewports as Vale's crossing shrank to a cluster of buildings, then a point, then nothing. Hayes clapped him on the shoulder. "You look exhausted." "I am exhausted. 3 months of community organizing is harder than combat." "What happened down there?" Jonas considered the question, thought about how to summarize chaos transformed to cooperation, competition reforged into community. "I crashed, they helped, and we figured out that the rarest thing in the galaxy isn't a man. It's people remembering how to work together instead of tearing each other apart over scarcity." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "That's unusually philosophical for a cargo pilot." "I had a lot of time to think while repairing water systems." Jonas settled into the co-pilot seat, feeling the familiar vibration of a ship under thrust. "Also, I may have accidentally become a legend, which is deeply embarrassing, and I'd appreciate it if you never mentioned this to anyone." "A legend, you?" "Long story. Involves cultural misunderstandings, aggressive hospitality, and me learning that sometimes the best way to help is to make yourself boring." Jonas closed his eyes, feeling exhaustion catch up with him now that the adrenaline of departure was fading. "Wake me when we hit the jump point. I need about a week of sleep." He drifted off to the sound of engine hum and Hayes muttering something about typical Reith luck. And for the first time in 3 months, Jonas slept without wondering if he'd wake to find someone having a territorial dispute over his breakfast schedule. 3 years later, the story of Vale's crossing spread through trade networks in the way stories do when they're too interesting to keep quiet. Haulers stopping for fuel at border stations, would hear about the isolated colony that nearly destroyed itself over one crashed pilot. Traders would swap tales about the human who taught cooperation by organizing infrastructure repairs. The details morphed and changed with each telling. Some versions had Jonas as a diplomat sent deliberately. Others made him a romantic figure torn between lovers. A few particularly creative retellings involved combat and dramatic rescues that never happened. The truth, preserved in Vale's Crossing's own records and transmitted through their newly reopened communication channels, was simpler and somehow more impactful. A tired pilot crashed, a community fractured under the weight of his presence, and instead of taking advantage or running away, he chose the hard option, teaching by example that unity mattered more than possession, that cooperation beat competition, that the rarest thing in the galaxy wasn't scarcity but the willingness to share abundance. Anthropologists studying human-alien cultural interactions added Vale's Crossing to their case files. Sociologists wrote papers about community dynamics and isolation. Therapists recommended the story to clients struggling with jealousy and possessiveness, pointing out that an entire settlement learned to choose differently. Jonas himself remained blissfully unaware of his growing reputation, having moved on to other routes, other cargo runs, other disasters waiting to happen. He upgraded to a better ship, the reasonable excuse, and made a point of filing more detailed navigation charts so he'd stop crashing on uncharted moons. When asked about Vale's Crossing during port stops, he'd deflect with humor. "I fixed some pipes and left," he'd say. People make it sound more dramatic than it was. But sometimes, late in the ship's night cycle when he couldn't sleep, Jonas would pull up the messages that still trickled in from Vale's Crossing. Updates about successful trade negotiations, news about expansion projects, occasional personal notes from Sierra or Liss or Murren telling him how the community continued to thrive. The last message, received on the 3rd anniversary of his departure, came from Murren. It was brief, characteristic of her efficient communication style. "Jonah's wreath, the relay you left continues to function perfectly. We've established trade routes with 4 systems, welcomed 3 new settlers, and successfully negotiated a mining contract that brings legitimate income. Vale's Crossing is no longer isolated. More importantly, we remember the lesson you taught, that our strength is in unity, not in what we can claim. The water system still runs at 95%. We tell ourselves you'd be annoyed it's not 100. Thank you for crashing into our lives and teaching us to fix more than just infrastructure. You are missed. You are remembered. And the story of what happened here spreads farther every year, not because you were special, but because you showed us we already were." Fair skies, Jonah's wreath. Jonas read it twice, smiled, and filed it with the others. Then he plotted his next route, a straightforward run to the inner colonies that had 0 chance of disaster. The navigation computer immediately flagged 17 potential hazards. "Of course there are," Jonas muttered, making adjustments. "Because the universe has a sense of humor and I'm the punchline." But as the reasonable excuse jumped to faster than light, carrying cargo and one perpetually exhausted pilot toward the next inevitable catastrophe, Jonas found himself thinking about Vale's Crossing, about purple grass and broken ribs, and a community that learned to choose unity over envy. It wasn't a bad legacy for someone who just wanted a place to sleep. The story lived on, growing in the retelling, spreading through trade routes and colony reports and late-night conversations in station bars. The legend of Vale's Crossing and the human who brought harmony where none dared to hope. Some versions were accurate, most weren't, but they all carried the same core truth, that sometimes the greatest impact comes not from grand gestures or heroic deeds, but from one stubborn person choosing patience, cooperation, and respect when chaos would have been easier. And somewhere in the black, Jonah's wreath flew on, accumulating new disasters, fixing new problems, and remaining blissfully ordinary despite the universe's best